Air moves through a narrow vent. The room is quiet enough to make a man hear himself think. That is part of the test. There is no cockpit noise, no engine vibration, no instructor leaning over his shoulder, no horizon, no clouds, no runway lights sliding under the nose of an aircraft. There is a chamber wall. There is a medical routine. There is a young pilot living under observation. His name is Valentin Bondarenko. He is 24 years old. He is a fighter pilot in the Soviet Air Forces. He is also a member of the first group of men chosen for a task that still sounds impossible when stripped of patriotic varnish. The Soviet Union intends to put a human being into space. Bondarenko is among those being prepared for that future. He has the compact body the spacecraft demands. He has the pilot's discipline. He has the particular kind of youth that large national projects find useful because it can be trained into endurance before it has learned to distrust slogans. The chamber around him is a medical instrument. Its purpose is to test isolation. It is meant to study how a man behaves when confined, watched, and deprived of normal human company. The doctors want to know whether the future cosmonaut can remain stable when the world has been reduced to a sealed compartment and a schedule. The answer matters. A spacecraft is also a sealed compartment. A spacecraft is also a schedule. Inside the chamber, the pressure is low. The oxygen level is high. The arrangement has a practical medical logic, and like many practical arrangements in early spaceflight, it also carries a trap inside it. Bondarenko is near the end of the day's work. He removes biomedical sensors from his skin. Adhesive marks remain. He cleans them with a small piece of cotton soaked in alcohol. This is an ordinary motion. A tired man at the end of a monitored day, a little cleanup, a little impatience. The great tragedies of machinery often begin with gestures so small they feel insulting when placed beside the death that follows. Bondarenko discards the cotton. It lands on an electric hot plate, and a quick breath of flame. For one brief instant, the fire is still a little thing. Then the air becomes an accomplice. Oxygen does not burn by itself. That sentence can make oxygen sound innocent. It is not innocent in a room like this. It makes other things burn with a speed that belongs to another moral universe. It lowers the threshold for ignition. It makes fabric dangerous. It turns a minor flame into a fast animal. Bondarenko sees the fire. He does what a human being does. He tries to stop it. He reaches toward the flame and attempts to smother it with his sleeve. In ordinary air, that instinct might have worked. In the chamber, the instinct becomes fatal. His clothing catches. The fire climbs him. Outside, the observers understand that something has gone wrong. The chamber cannot simply be opened like a kitchen door. Pressure must be dealt with. The sealed experiment has become a rescue problem, and the rescue problem has entered a race against flame. The machine runs on procedure. The body runs on seconds. By the time Bondarenko is removed, he is alive. That is one of the facts that makes the story harder to bear. He is taken to Botkin Hospital in Moscow. Doctors work on him. Later accounts describe severe burns and a young man still conscious enough to speak. Some details come to us through recollection, and recollection is a damaged vessel when secrecy has already poisoned the archive. So we move carefully. What can be said with competence is grim enough. On March 23, 1961, Valentin Bondarenko dies. Less than 3 weeks later, Yuri Gagarin will orbit Earth. The Soviet Union will announce a triumph that changes human history. The hidden cost of that triumph will remain behind a closed door. The clicking is slow and uneven. Bondarenko was born in Kharkiv in 1937, in a century that made boys grow up quickly. His childhood belonged to a Soviet world shaped by war and reconstruction. Aviation had become one of the great ladders of that world. It promised status. It promised danger with a uniform. It promised a route into the state's mythology. A good pilot was never merely a technician. He was proof. He proved discipline. He proved nerve. He proved that flesh could be trained to sit inside an aluminum argument and bring it home. By 1960, the Soviet space program needed men who could carry that same proof higher. The first cosmonaut group was selected in secrecy. The men did not step into public life as famous explorers. They entered a hidden military and medical machine. Their bodies were measured. Their habits were judged. Their reactions were watched as closely as a pressure gauge. These men had to fit into Vostok. That requirement alone shaped the Corps. The spacecraft was small. Its descent module was spherical. Its pilot was more passenger than aviator during key phases of flight, since Soviet engineers trusted automation more than human control during the first attempts to reach orbit. Yet the man inside still mattered. He would bear the political meaning. He would sit inside the risk. He would come back, if the system worked, as a living banner. The public would later see Gagarin smile and hear a clean story. A brave Soviet man goes into orbit. A machine performs. Socialism reaches the heavens before capitalism can lace its boots. Behind that clean story was the workshop smell of the early space race. Burned insulation, medical adhesive, fuel residue, sweat inside pressure garments. There was also fear. The men selected for the cosmonaut corps understood enough to be afraid. They were not fools in helmets. They knew machines failed. They knew pilots died. They knew secrecy did not make danger disappear. It only decided who was allowed to speak of it. Bondarenko was the youngest among them. That matters because youth gives the tragedy its particular edge. He was not an old master at the end of a long career. He was a young husband and father, a pilot still being formed by the machinery around him. The state had not finished using him. Space had not yet had the chance. The chamber got there first. To understand the death of Valentin Bondarenko, we have to resist the lazy version of the story. The lazy version says the Soviets were reckless, the chamber had oxygen, and a young man died because a totalitarian system hid a mistake. There is truth inside that version. There is also too little machinery. The deeper story begins with the strange appeal of pure oxygen. Early spacecraft designers faced hard constraints. Every pound mattered. Every valve had to justify itself. Every gas inside the cabin had to be carried, regulated, monitored, and made safe for a living body. A mixed atmosphere like the air at sea level contains nitrogen along with oxygen. That is what we breathe on Earth. In a spacecraft, nitrogen adds mass and complication. It also raises decompression concerns when pressure changes. A low-pressure, pure oxygen environment offered a tempting answer. Keep the pressure lower. Provide enough oxygen for the crew. Simplify the system. On paper, this had elegance. Machines often seduce engineers this way. A line disappears from a diagram, a tank gets smaller, a procedure looks cleaner. The drawing smiles back like a clerk who knows where the bodies are filed. Fire does not care about elegance. An oxygen-rich atmosphere makes common materials behave differently. Fabric ignites more easily. A small heat source becomes more dangerous. A flame that might gutter in ordinary air can spread with shocking force when oxygen surrounds it. Bondarenko's chamber was built for a medical test, not a launch. That distinction matters. He was not inside Vostok. He was not sitting above a rocket. He was in a ground facility, under observation, inside a room whose danger had become abstract because the activity inside it felt routine. Routine is one of the deadliest words in aerospace. It means the danger has put on slippers. The chamber test required discipline, but it did not look like combat with a machine. Bondarenko was not fighting a spin. He was not riding an engine burn. He was not falling through re-entry plasma. He was passing time, following instructions, and living in a controlled environment. The environment was controlled until it was not. At the end of the work period, he removed the sensors. Alcohol was used to clean his skin. The cotton struck the hot plate. The little domestic convenience in the chamber became the ignition source. Bondarenko's sleeve became the next fuel. The trap had been waiting for a sequence. It got one. The facts after ignition are painful because they leave so little room for heroics. Bondarenko tried to beat the flames down himself. That first instinct may have delayed the alarm. It may also have been the only thing his mind could do in the first seconds. Fire near the body does not invite philosophy. It demands motion. The oxygen-rich air made that motion useless. His clothing burned. The chamber pressure complicated rescue. Observers outside had to equalize conditions before opening the door. Different accounts give different details about how long this took. Some later summaries describe a delay long enough to feel almost unreal. The exact number of minutes matters less than the cruel design fact. Help existed only a few feet away, yet the chamber made those few feet into a frontier. This is why sealed environments deserve a special dread. They transform distance. A man can be visible and unreachable. He can be close enough to see and too far away to save. Glass, metal, pressure, and procedure become a kind of geography. When Bondarenko was finally removed, the damage had already been done. He was taken to Botkin Hospital. Doctors fought for him there. Later testimony from people connected to the case described the horror of his injuries. Some accounts say he blamed himself. That line appears often, and it may be true. Still, it deserves suspicion. Systems love a confession from the dead. A young man may have made the final, small mistake. He did not design the chamber. He did not choose its atmosphere. He did not set the rules by which rescue had to pass through pressure before reaching flesh. The cotton was his. The trap belonged to the program. There is a strange intimacy in hospital accounts from technological disasters. The public remembers the machine. The hospital receives the body. After the explosion, after the fire, after the abort, after the crash, there is often a room with white sheets and people speaking in low voices. In that room, the grand program shrinks to the size of a wound. Bondarenko's final hours are difficult to reconstruct with precision. That is one of the consequences of secrecy. The documents arrive late. The memoirs arrive through memory. The state has already handled the evidence. The historian must keep one hand on the rail. We know he died after the chamber fire. We know he died before Gagarin's flight. We know the public was not told. The silence around him was not an accident. It was part of the Soviet system's method of protecting triumph. The space program had become a theater in which ideological greatness had to appear clean. Launches that succeeded were trumpeted. Failures were muffled. Names could be withheld. Photographs could be retouched. The official story was not a record. It was a machine for producing belief. Bondarenko's death did not fit. If the Soviet Union told the world that a cosmonaut trainee had burned alive during a ground experiment, it would stain the imminent triumph. It would raise questions before Gagarin flew. It would give foreign analysts a line of attack. It would remind Soviet citizens that the path upward was being paved with bodies. So the state did what it knew how to do. It locked the story away. Bondarenko's family still had to live with the death. His comrades still had to know what happened. The doctors still had to remember. The chamber still had to be examined. Fire leaves marks that propaganda cannot polish from metal. The world heard nothing. Brief voices vanish into static. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin rode Vostok 1 into orbit. That sentence still carries majesty. A human being left Earth, circled it, and came home alive. No honest account of the dark side of the space race should cheapen that achievement. Gagarin's flight was one of the great human crossings. The first orbit changed what mankind could say about itself. Yet the timing is brutal. Bondarenko died on March 23rd. Gagarin flew on April 12th. Between those dates, the Soviet program moved from a burned trainee in a hospital to the most dazzling public victory in space history. The machine did not stop. The political hunger did not pause to mourn in public. The triumph rose above the grave without acknowledging the ground beneath it. Gagarin himself should not be made smaller by this. He was brave. He accepted risk. He did not create the silence around Bondarenko. He was also a young pilot caught inside a system that turned men into symbols before it allowed them to be fully human in public. The first orbit and the hidden fire belong to the same world. That is the point. The space race was glorious because the achievements were real. It was dark because the cost was managed like classified cargo. Now cross the ocean. The United States did not know the full story of Valentin Bondarenko in 1961. American intelligence may have gathered fragments about Soviet risks, but the details of the chamber fire were not public. NASA could not study Bondarenko's accident the way it would later study its own. Yet NASA did not need Bondarenko to know that oxygen fire was dangerous. That is the uncomfortable part for any clean accusation. American engineers and medical researchers had their own experience with oxygen-rich environments. The danger was discussed. It was tested. It was known in enough places to make ignorance a weak defense. Pure oxygen had been used in Mercury and Gemini. NASA's reasoning had technical roots. A low-pressure pure oxygen cabin reduced design burdens. It helped avoid certain decompression issues. It had history behind it. Apollo expanded the scale. The command module was larger and more complex than Mercury or Gemini. More wiring ran through it. More material surrounded the crew. More systems had to share the cabin with human beings. A small spacecraft can be dangerous in 1,000 ways. A larger one adds hiding places for failure. Apollo Command Module 012 was a Block 1 spacecraft. It was never meant to go to the moon. It was meant for Earth orbital testing. That did not make it safe. In some ways, the early craft carried the roughness of a machine, still being argued into shape. The crew assigned to Apollo 1 knew the spacecraft had problems. Virgil Gus Grissom had already flown Mercury and Gemini. He was not a mascot. He had survived the Liberty Bell 7 incident when his Mercury capsule sank after splashdown and he nearly drowned in the Atlantic. Edward White had performed America's first spacewalk during Gemini 4. Roger Chaffee had not yet flown in space, but he had earned his place by training and nerve. They saw the command module up close. They smelled its flaws. Grissom became openly frustrated with the spacecraft. The crew had posed with a lemon as a visual joke aimed at the vehicle's defects. It was dark humor from men who were too experienced to mistake schedule for readiness. On January 27, 1967, the three astronauts entered the command module at Cape Kennedy for a plugs-out test. The test was on the ground. That is why it felt safer than flight. That is why it became deadly in a way flight might not have been. The cabin was sealed. The atmosphere was pure oxygen at pressure above the outside air. This detail is crucial. In flight, Apollo would use low-pressure oxygen. On the pad, during this test, the command module sat under a far more dangerous condition. The oxygen pressure made materials inside the cabin easier to ignite and made flame spread more violent. It also made the hatch problem worse. The hatch opened inward. That design was not irrational in every context. Engineers make trade-offs under constraints. Yet inside a pressurized capsule during a fire, inward opening became a sentence written in metal. Cabin pressure held the hatch shut. The crew had to vent the spacecraft before opening it. The rescuers outside faced heat, smoke, and a multi-layer hatch arrangement that took time to defeat. Time was the one thing they did not have. The test had already been troublesome. Communications were poor. The countdown was delayed. Grissom's irritation came through in his famous complaint about poor communications between buildings on Earth when the program intended to communicate from the moon. Then came the fire. The Apollo 204 Review Board could not identify one final ignition source with certainty. It did identify the conditions that made the disaster possible. The cabin contained combustible material. The oxygen atmosphere allowed rapid burning. The hatch prevented fast escape. The first report of fire came from inside the spacecraft. Within seconds, the cabin became unsurvivable. Grissom, White, and Chaffee died on the pad. No rocket rose. No engine failed. No parachute tore loose. The spacecraft killed them while standing still. This is where Bondarenko returns to the story. Not as a simple cause, as a warning that had already happened in the world. The Soviet chamber and the Apollo command module were different environments. Bondarenko was in a training chamber. The Apollo crew was in a spacecraft. The chamber involved medical isolation. Apollo 1 involved a launch pad test of a crewed vehicle. The differences matter. So does the rhyme. Both accidents involved sealed volumes. Both involved oxygen-rich atmospheres. Both trapped living men behind barriers that could not be opened fast enough. Both began with a small ignition and ended with the old lesson that fire, given oxygen and confinement, becomes a tyrant. If the Soviet Union had made Bondarenko's death public in 1961, would Apollo 1 have been prevented? That question is tempting. It is also dangerous. We should avoid making a dead Soviet trainee into a magic key that unlocks an American disaster. NASA had warning enough from its own work. The Apollo fire was not born from a lack of one Soviet report. It grew from design decisions, material choices, test procedures, and a culture that normalized the hazards it lived beside. Still, secrecy mattered. A known fatal accident in a high-oxygen sealed chamber would have been a powerful case study. It would have carried the force of a body rather than a memo. Engineers can argue with calculations. Managers can file warnings under future review. A burned cosmonaut trainee is harder to turn into paperwork, unless nobody is allowed to know. That is the moral injury in Bondarenko's concealment. His death contained knowledge. The state buried the knowledge with the man. There is a phrase people like to use after disaster: lessons learned. It is a tidy phrase, too tidy. A lesson is not learned when it is written down. It is learned when it changes behavior. A lesson that remains trapped in a report has the dignity of a museum exhibit. and the practical power of a sleeping cat. Bondarenko's death appears to have affected Soviet awareness of oxygen fire risk inside the program. That makes sense. Even a secret death can frighten the people who know the secret. Soviet space medicine and spacecraft operations did not ignore fire forever. During later missions, cosmonauts had reason to remember what oxygen could do. Yet the public record was denied the lesson. NASA's Apollo 1 changes came after 3 American astronauts died. The command module was redesigned. The hatch was replaced with one that could open outward quickly. Cabin materials were reviewed with a new seriousness. Ground test atmosphere practices changed. Fire safety moved from concern to commandment. That is the bitter rhythm of aerospace safety. The rulebook grows after the funeral. The Apollo 1 investigation had public force because the accident had public witnesses, public grief, and public consequences. NASA suffered under daylight. Congress asked questions. The press followed the story. Engineers had to explain themselves in a system where failure could be embarrassing in front of voters. The Soviet Union had a different bargain. It avoided public embarrassment. It also weakened public correction. Daylight is a rough medicine. Secrecy is easier to swallow. The trouble is that secrecy does not disinfect anything. It keeps the infection warm. Let us return to the chamber one more time, because the chamber is the whole story in miniature. A young man sits inside a controlled environment. The state has arranged the environment in order to study him. The atmosphere is chosen for technical reasons. The exit is governed by mechanical conditions. A small error occurs. The environment magnifies the error until it becomes lethal. The rescue team can see the problem, but the same system built for control delays access. Afterward, the state controls the story too. That is the dark geometry of the event. Control appears at every stage. The chamber controls the body. The pressure controls the door. The oxygen controls the fire. The state controls the memory. Bondarenko disappears inside each layer. He disappears first into the test, then into the flames, then into the hospital, then into the archive. Only much later does the name come back. By then, the space race has already acquired its monuments. The first orbit has happened. The first spacewalk has happened. The first moon landing has happened. The dead are already arranged in official memory, and Bondarenko arrives late, like a missing photograph found behind a cabinet. History has to make room for him. Not as legend, as fact. There is a reason this story attracts ghost tales. Soviet secrecy created a fog in which rumor could breed. Western listeners heard claims of lost cosmonauts, failed missions, hidden radio transmissions, and voices vanishing in the upper air. Some stories were false, some were misread signals, some were Cold War folklore looking for a coffin. Bondarenko needs none of that. His true story is worse, because it is smaller. He did not die screaming over a radio as his spacecraft drifted beyond rescue. He did not vanish on a secret orbital mission. He did not become a phantom circling Earth. He died in a ground chamber. He died in a room built by professionals. He died during preparation, while the future was still being fitted to men one sensor at a time. That is more frightening than the myth. A fantasy lets us put the terror at a distance. The real accident puts it in a lab, on a workday, near a hot plate. It says the road to space may kill a man before the rocket is even rolled out. The ordinary object is what makes the story bite. A cotton ball. The phrase almost resists solemnity. It sounds too soft to belong in an autopsy. Yet in the right atmosphere, with the wrong heat source, it becomes the first domino. The majesty of spaceflight meets a piece of medical waste, and the medical waste wins. A tired engineer would not call that irony. He would call it Tuesday, then ban hot plates from the chamber. Bondarenko's death also forces a question about heroism. The public version of the space race prefers heroes in clean scenes. A rocket lifts, a pilot waves, a capsule splashes down, a parade follows. Heroism becomes visible, polished, and approved for school children. Training deaths complicate that story. There is no victorious photograph. There is no last transmission fit for a monument. There is no clear battlefield. The death happens in the machinery beneath fame, where men are prepared for deeds the public may someday applaud. Was Bondarenko heroic? The answer depends on whether we allow preparation to count. He accepted selection into a program whose risks were only partly known. He submitted to physical and psychological tests that turned his body into evidence. He entered the chamber because the program required it. He endured the isolation until a small accident exposed a large hazard. That is a form of service. It deserves public memory. A culture that honors only the final flight misunderstands how dangerous things are built. The pilot in orbit is the visible edge of a vast structure. Beneath him are test subjects, ground crews, medical staff, factory workers, and men whose names rarely reach the plaque. Bondarenko was one of those men. He paid before the world knew the bill had arrived. 6 years after Bondarenko's death, Apollo 1 made the oxygen lesson impossible for America to ignore. There is an awful symmetry in the calendar. March 1961. A Soviet trainee burns in an oxygen-rich chamber. January 1967. 3 American astronauts die in a pure oxygen spacecraft during a ground test. Between those dates, both nations moved fast. The Soviet Union achieved first orbit. The United States committed itself to the moon. Gemini taught rendezvous and spacewalking. Apollo grew under deadlines that came from the White House and hardened into program culture. The men inside the machines were brave. The systems around them were impatient. Those two facts do not cancel each other. They make the history sharper. People sometimes discuss spaceflight as if courage excuses bad design. That is backward. Courage increases the obligation to design well. A brave crew will accept danger. That does not give managers permission to confuse acceptance with consent to carelessness. Bondarenko accepted the test. He did not consent to a chamber where one discarded cotton ball could become a death sentence. Grissom, White, and Chaffee accepted Apollo. They did not consent to being sealed inside a capsule where escape lost the race before the fire began. The dead cannot revise the paperwork. The living must. The autopsy of Bondarenko's accident begins with atmosphere. In ordinary air, flame requires fuel, heat, and oxygen. In a chamber rich with oxygen, one side of that triangle becomes oversized. The system waits for heat. When heat arrives, the fire no longer behaves like a household nuisance. It moves with a speed that surprises people who have spent their lives around ordinary air. The second factor is confinement. A sealed chamber contains the atmosphere that feeds the fire. It also keeps the victim inside the hazard. A door that requires pressure equalization may be perfectly sensible during normal operations. During a fire, it becomes an argument against survival. The third factor is material. Clothing matters, adhesive matters, insulation matters, padding matters. Any object placed in oxygen-rich confinement must be treated as a suspect. If it can burn, it may burn faster than the rescue plan can operate. The fourth factor is habit. This is the one engineers sometimes dislike because it sounds less mechanical, yet habit kills. When a dangerous setup is used repeatedly without disaster, people begin to treat survival as evidence of safety. They forget that the system may be waiting for a missing condition. Bondarenko supplied the missing condition by accident. Apollo 1 supplied its own. A fire investigation can identify causes. A moral investigation asks why the causes were allowed to sit so close together. A hatch is a confession. It tells us how fast designers thought trouble would move. The Apollo 1 hatch confessed too much. It had been designed in a way that made quick escape impossible under the conditions of the fire. After the accident, NASA changed the hatch. That change is often described as a technical correction, which it was. It was also an admission. The old design had assumed time. The fire took time away. Bondarenko's chamber door made a related confession. Pressure control had priority until flame exposed the cost. Under ordinary medical testing, the sealed chamber made sense. Under fire, it gave rescue a locked jaw. We should be fair. Engineers cannot design every object around every nightmare. They must make trade-offs. Yet oxygen fire in sealed environments was not an exotic fantasy. It was a known class of hazard, even if its full practical cruelty had not been absorbed by every program office. The lesson is clear enough. When human beings are sealed inside an artificial atmosphere, exit speed becomes part of life support. It is not a convenience. It is breath in another form. The Soviet Union eventually acknowledged Bondarenko. The timing varies by account because disclosure came through stages of late Soviet openness and Western reporting. His name returned to the public record long after it could have warned the world in the moment. By then, he had become a historical absence. Absence has important weight. It changes group photographs. It changes memoirs. It changes how survivors speak. A dead colleague who cannot be publicly named becomes a kind of private weather. Everyone who knows carries the pressure. Nobody outside hears the storm. That silence also shaped the mythology of Soviet spaceflight. For years, the public saw a version of the program that looked cleaner than reality. Gagarin, Titov, Tereshkova, Leonov. Firsts, medals, smiles, televised pride. The failures were there, but many stayed hidden until later. The result was a strange imbalance. The Soviet program seemed almost magical when it succeeded and almost unknowable when it failed. Bondarenko belongs in the unknowable part. He reminds us that propaganda is not only falsehood, it is also selection. It decides which truths get to stand under light. A nation can tell the truth about Gagarin and still lie by omission about Bondarenko. The orbit happened. The fire happened. The honest history contains both. Apollo 1 was different because the United States could not hide it in the same way. The accident happened at Cape Kennedy. The crew were publicly known. NASA was a civilian agency, though its roots and contractors were deeply tied to military engineering. The deaths had to be explained. The explanation was painful, incomplete in places, and damaging. That damage did some good. The Apollo program stopped and changed. The spacecraft was redesigned. Fire safety standards tightened. The command module that eventually carried astronauts to the moon was not the same careless box that killed the Apollo 1 crew. That fact does not redeem the deaths. It shows what public failure can force. The moon landing came less than 3 years later. That chronology can amaze. It can also mislead. Apollo 11 was possible in part because Apollo 1 became unbearable. The burned capsule forced seriousness into the program with a violence no manager could soften. Grissom, White, and Chafee did not die so others could succeed. That phrase is too neat. They died because a system failed them. The later success cannot turn that into strategy. Bondarenko's case is more tragic in one respect. His death had less power to correct the world because the world was denied it. That is the final cruelty of secrecy. It reduces the reach of sacrifice. If this episode has a villain, it is not a single man. It is oxygen treated as housekeeping. It is a sealed door treated as paperwork. It is schedule pressure treated as patriotism. It is secrecy treated as dignity. Nobody needed to wake that morning intending to kill Valentin Bondarenko. That is what makes the event more useful than a simple morality play. Disasters inside technical programs are often made from ordinary decisions that meet under abnormal conditions. A hot plate in a chamber. Alcohol near heat. A high oxygen atmosphere. A door that cannot open instantly. A rescue procedure slower than flame. Break one link and Bondarenko may live. Remove the hot plate. Change the atmosphere. Control the cleaning materials. Dress him in less flammable clothing. Design the chamber for emergency access. Train the observer to treat a small flame as a full emergency from the first second. Each correction sounds obvious afterward. Disaster has a way of making everyone wise at the funeral. Beforehand, the correction must compete with convenience. It must compete with schedule. It must compete with the human tendency to say, "We have done this before." The fire waits for that sentence. There is no need to make Bondarenko into a saint. He was a young pilot. He likely had ambition. He likely wanted to fly. He likely wanted his place among the men who would carry the Soviet Union into the sky. He may have been proud. He may have been afraid. Good history leaves room for ordinary humanity. The state wanted symbols. The chamber received a man. That distinction is the heart of the story. A symbol can be hidden, polished, or rearranged. A man feels heat. A man calls for help. A man leaves behind people who remember his voice without needing permission from a ministry. The public memory of spaceflight often moves too quickly from death to lesson. It wants the moral, the improvement, the redesigned hatch, the next successful mission. It wants the upward line restored. Bondarenko asks for a slower gaze. He asks us to remain in the room. The fire begins. The door holds. The rescuers work. The seconds leave. The program continues. The name disappears. Only after that should the rocket rise. The dark side of the space race was not darkness opposed to greatness. It was darkness braided through greatness. The same age that gave mankind its first orbit also gave us a hidden training death in an oxygen chamber. The same pursuit that produced the moon landing also produced Apollo 1. Glory and negligence stood closer than public memory likes to admit. There was majesty. There was also paperwork. There was courage. There was also bad material control. There was wonder. There was also a chamber door that opened too late. To tell the history honestly, we must keep those truths in the same frame. Valentin Bondarenko's death did not stop Gagarin. It did not stop Vostok. It did not stop the Soviet Union from claiming its rightful first in human spaceflight. It did not directly stop Apollo from repeating the same family of danger years later. That is exactly why it matters. Some deaths change history loudly. Others reveal what history was already willing to spend. Near the end, the image to hold is simple. Not a launch pad, not a moon. Not a heroic portrait with the chin raised toward history. A sealed chamber, a young man inside. A small flame where no flame should matter. Outside, doctors and technicians are close enough to witness the emergency. They are not close enough to end it. The room has become a machine for separating help from the person who needs it. Later, the report will be handled. The program will move. The orbit will come. The world will hear Gagarin's name. For years, it will not hear Bondarenko's. That silence is part of the accident. The fire took his life in minutes. The state kept his name shut away for decades. When the name finally returned, it carried a warning that should never have needed permission to speak. In an oxygen-rich room, nothing is ordinary. Not cotton, not cloth, not a door, not a mistake, and certainly not silence. The room tone continues for 3 seconds, then cuts.